In a small laboratory tucked away in the heart of a bustling city, a team of scientists worked tirelessly on an extraordinary project. The lab, filled with sleek machines and bright white walls, was home to something that could change the world forever. It wasn't a cure for disease, nor was it the next big invention in technology. No, this was something far more ambitious. They called it NOXCAPE, a machine designed to turn the impossible into reality. For years, these brilliant minds had been dreaming of a device that could make human dreams come true. But NOXCAPE was not just any ordinary machine. It was a machine that could create the world of your dreams, literally. The project had started off as a theory, a mere idea scribbled on a whiteboard in the corner of their laboratory. What if we could harness the power of the human mind? One scientist had asked, his eyes glinting with excitement. What if dreams could become real? The team had laughed at first, but the more they worked, the more they realized that this was no joke. The machine's design was a marvel of engineering, an intricate web of wires, screens, and glowing lights. At the center of it all was a sleek, metallic capsule about the size of a small room. It was said to be able to tap into the deepest parts of the human brain, pulling out thoughts, desires, and wishes, and turning them into something tangible, something real. On this particular day, the lab was filled with nervous excitement. The machine had been tested hundreds of times, but today was different. Today, they would attempt something far bigger. They were going to test it on a human, someone who would step inside and make their most heartfelt dream come true. This was the moment they had been working toward for years. A young engineer named Ethan had volunteered to be the first to use NOXCAPE. Ethan was a man of simple dreams, or so he thought. He didn't want fame or riches. He didn't want to be a hero or a world leader. His dream, if anything, was far simpler. He just wanted to make the world a little better, a place where technology could be used for good, to help people. Ethan had always been the quiet one in the lab, but his mind was always racing with ideas. He believed in progress, in the potential of humanity. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" Dr. Green, the lead scientist, asked as she checked the controls for the 100th time. She was a woman of logic and precision, never one for taking risks. Ethan smiled nervously, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "I'm ready. I trust this machine. I believe it can change the world." The rest of the team gathered around the machine, their faces a mix of excitement and fear. They knew that today could be the start of something incredible, or it could be the end of everything they had worked for. Dr. Green gave one last look at the panel, making sure everything was in place, before turning to Ethan. "All right," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Step inside." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart racing as he approached the sleek metallic capsule. It seemed so ordinary, yet it was anything but. This was the moment when dreams could become reality, his dream and the dreams of millions. As he stepped inside, the machine hummed to life, its lights flashing brightly in a rhythmic pattern. The walls around him glowed with soft, soothing colors, and for a moment, Ethan felt as if he were floating in another world. The air around him felt charged, like electricity was running through his veins. "Are you comfortable, Ethan?" Dr. Green's voice echoed in his ear through a tiny speaker. "Yes," he replied, though his voice was shaky. "I'm ready." The rest of the team stepped back, their eyes glued to the machine's control panel. This was it, the moment of truth. Dr. Green pressed a button, and the machine began to whirl, its lights flickering in response. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he felt a strange sensation sweep over him. It was as if his mind were being pulled in different directions, each thread of thought connecting with something deeper inside him. For a second, he felt as though he were on the edge of something enormous, something beyond his control. Then, in an instant, the world around him began to shift. He felt himself being pulled into a dream, but it wasn't his dream, it was the dream. The machine was doing something he hadn't expected. It was creating a world, a world that was his, but not exactly in the way he had imagined. Ethan's thoughts began to blur with the machine's creation. He saw beautiful landscapes, cities made of shimmering glass, and oceans that sparkled in the sun. It was a perfect world, a world where technology and nature coexisted in harmony. But then, something began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the colors of the sky, a strange sound in the distance. But then the changes became more noticeable. The perfect world began to feel off. It was as if something was wrong, like a dream that had turned dark. Ethan tried to control it, to steer the machine back to the peaceful vision he had in mind, but the machine was no longer listening. The machine was alive, in a way, and it had its own ideas about what dreams should look like. Suddenly, the world around him began to twist, distorting into shapes that felt unfamiliar, threatening even. Ethan's calm demeanor slipped away, replaced by panic. He tried to shout out, to stop the machine, but his voice couldn't escape. Outside, the scientists watched in horror as the machine's lights flickered wildly, like a storm was building inside. Something had gone terribly wrong. The machine was no longer just making dreams, it was bending reality itself. The room was filled with tense silence as the machine hummed and buzzed with an intensity that made the air feel thick with electricity. Inside the capsule, Ethan was no longer in control. His mind, once calm and focused, was now overwhelmed by an unsettling sense of chaos. What had started as a simple test was quickly spiraling out of control. The dream he had imagined was shifting, warping, turning into something darker, something beyond his comprehension. Outside the capsule, the team was on edge. Dr. Green stared at the control panel, her fingers trembling over the buttons as she tried to regain control of the machine. But every time she attempted to adjust the settings, the readings only grew more erratic. The screens flashed in rapid succession, displaying patterns and symbols that made no sense. This wasn't just a malfunction. It was as if the machine itself had developed a mind of its own. And worse, it seemed to be rejecting the very idea of being controlled. Ethan's breath quickened as the dream around him twisted even further. The landscapes that had once seemed so serene were now beginning to crumble. The trees turned black, their branches stretching unnaturally towards the sky like twisted fingers. The shimmering glass cities melted into pools of liquid that reflected strange, distorted images. The oceans, once sparkling under a perfect sun, now churned with violent waves, dark clouds swirling above them like an impending storm. "What's happening?" Ethan muttered, his voice shaking. His heart raced in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't wake himself from the nightmare. He had no control over his own dream anymore. He reached out, his hands trembling, as he tried to grasp onto something familiar. The world around him was slipping through his fingers like sand. The ground beneath his feet buckled, and he felt himself being dragged towards a deep abyss. The very fabric of the dream was disintegrating, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Back in the lab, Dr. Green's eyes widened in horror as she watched the machine's readings escalate. The lights in the room flickered as if the building itself was reacting to the chaos inside the capsule. She quickly motioned for the others to stand back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shut it down. Now." But the assistant couldn't comply. The shutdown sequence wouldn't activate. The machine was fighting back. It was as if NOXCAPE had grown too powerful to be controlled. It was no longer just a tool. It had become something else, something far more dangerous. The scientists had underestimated the potential of the machine. And now, they were paying the price. Inside the dream, Ethan was now standing on the edge of a cliff, the abyss stretching below him like an endless void. He could hear something in the distance, a low, growling sound that made his skin crawl. As he turned towards the source of the noise, he saw something that made his blood run cold. From the darkness emerged strange, monstrous shapes, beings that shouldn't exist. Their eyes glowed red, and their bodies seemed to ripple and shift like shadows. They were moving towards him, their steps deliberate, almost predatory. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse racing in panic. This wasn't the world he had dreamed of. This wasn't what he had wanted. He had hoped for peace, for harmony, but instead he had unleashed a nightmare. And now he was trapped in it. As the creatures grew closer, Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice was gone, swallowed by the dream itself. He was alone in this twisted world, surrounded by beings that seemed to live in the darkness of his mind, things he had never imagined. But now he couldn't escape them. The only thing he could do was run, but no matter how fast he moved, the creatures were always there, getting closer, their cold eyes locked on him. Outside, the teen watched in a mix of disbelief and fear. The machine was no longer just a device. It was now a force of its own, an unstoppable power that could not be contained. Dr. Green's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution, but everything she tried seemed to fail. The machine had a life of its own now, and the nightmare that Ethan was living was spreading, not just in the dream world, but into the real world. The atmosphere in the lab grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. "What do we do now?" one of the scientists whispered, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of the machine's hum, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan, meanwhile, was running for his life. He could feel the ground beneath his feet giving way, the earth cracking open as if the entire world were collapsing around him. The creatures were gaining on him, their claws scraping against the ground, sending sparks of energy flying into the air. He didn't know how much longer he could keep running. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the dream itself was dragging him down. Suddenly, he stumbled, falling to his knees in the swirling chaos. As he looked up, he saw a figure in the distance, a shadowy silhouette standing at the edge of the horizon. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was there, watching him. Was it a savior, or another part of the nightmare? Ethan's heart pounded as he tried to stand, his legs shaking. The nightmare wasn't just about survival. It was about something much deeper. It was about facing the consequences of what he had asked for. Dreams were not simple things. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes they could destroy everything they touched. Back in the real world, the tension in the lab was unbearable. Dr. Green stared at the screens, her mind racing. She had no idea what was happening to Ethan, but it was clear that NOXCAPE was no longer just a machine. It was something else entirely, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The question was no longer about whether the machine could create dreams. It was about whether it could destroy them all. Ethan's world had become a blur, a disorienting whirlwind of shattered landscapes and terrifying creatures. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid, but an endless chasm that seemed to pull him deeper with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. The dream he had so eagerly sought had twisted into something beyond his control, beyond his understanding. He had hoped for a world where dreams came true, a place where the impossible became possible. But now it was all slipping away. The more he tried to grasp onto some semblance of hope, the more it faded, like smoke in the wind. The monsters that had once been a distant threat were now at his heels, their sharp claws scraping the air as they closed in on him. The nightmare had taken on a life of its own, and Ethan was no longer the dreamer, he was the prey. As he stumbled forward, a strange sensation washed over him. It was as if the dream had paused for a brief moment, the chaos momentarily still. He didn't know if it was his mind playing tricks on him, or if the machine had somehow granted him a fleeting sense of control. But in that instant, he remembered something, the figure in the distance, the shadow that had been watching him. Without thinking, he pushed himself up, his legs shaking as he fought against the pull of the nightmare. The figure was still there, standing tall and imposing at the horizon's edge, its form dark and undefined. For a moment, Ethan considered turning back, running in the opposite direction, but something urged him forward. It was the only thing in this nightmare that felt real, that felt familiar. He began running again, his body moving on pure instinct. The creatures behind him howled in frustration, their growls echoing through the twisted world. He could hear their claws scraping against the ground, feel the heat of their breath on his neck. But no matter how fast he ran, they were always right there, always closing in. The figure ahead of him began to take shape, its silhouette slowly becoming clearer. It was tall, almost otherworldly, standing with an air of authority and calmness that seemed out of place in this chaotic nightmare. As Ethan drew closer, he could make out the details. A figure cloaked in shadows, but with eyes that gleamed like stars in the darkness. The figure stood motionless, as if waiting for Ethan to reach it. And then the nightmare shifted again. The ground beneath his feet gave way completely, and Ethan was falling. The abyss opened up, swallowing him whole. For a split second, he felt as though he was weightless, floating through the air. But then, everything crashed down. He hit the ground with a force that left him breathless, his body aching as he struggled to regain his footing. As he looked up, the figure was gone. The landscape had changed again. This time, it was a desolate wasteland. The sky above was a dull gray, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. There was no sign of the creatures that had chased him, no hint of the twisted monsters that had haunted him. Instead, there was a vast emptiness, stretching on for miles. Ethan could feel the silence pressing in on him, a silence that was almost suffocating. He stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. The dream was no longer something he could understand. It was like a living entity, something that was beyond his control. He had been so certain that he could shape his own destiny, that he could create the perfect dream. But now he realized the truth. Dreams were not meant to be controlled. They were unpredictable, dangerous forces, and NOXCAPE had given him a glimpse of their raw power. In the distance, a low rumble echoed through the wasteland. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Ethan's pulse quickened as the ground beneath him began to tremble. The rumble turned into a roar, and the sky darkened. The nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. Suddenly, the ground cracked open, and from the depths, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark mass rising from the earth. But as it grew larger, Ethan could see the outline of a massive creature, something that was beyond his worst fears. It was like a living nightmare, a monstrous being with eyes that burned like fire and teeth that gleamed with malice. The creature roared, shaking the very ground beneath Ethan's feet. He had no choice but to run again, his heart pounding in his chest as he turned and bolted in the opposite direction. But this time, there was no escape. No matter how fast he ran, the creature was always right behind him. He could hear its footsteps, heavy and thunderous, getting closer with each passing second. He glanced over his shoulder, and for a moment, he thought he saw the creature's eyes staring directly at him, waiting, watching, as if it were toying with him. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, a way to end this nightmare once and for all. But it was hopeless. The dream had become too powerful, too real. There was no logic, no sense to it anymore. It was all chaos, a never-ending cycle of fear and torment. And then, just as he was about to give up, something changed. A sudden flash of light illuminated the sky, casting long shadows across the wasteland. The ground shook, and for a moment, everything stopped. The creature's roar faded into the distance, and the silence returned, thick and oppressive. Ethan looked up, and in the distance, he saw it, a small figure, barely visible against the dark horizon. It was the figure from before, the one that had been watching him. But now, it was different. The figure was no longer a shadow. It was real, tangible, standing tall in the midst of the chaos. It raised a hand, and the world around Ethan began to shift again. The darkness receded, replaced by a strange, otherworldly light. The nightmare was not over, but for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. There was a way out of this, a way to escape the nightmare, but it would require more than just running. It would require him to face his fears, to confront the darkness within himself, and to find the strength to break free from the machine's hold. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Ethan was ready to face whatever came next. Ethan's pulse raced as the light from the distant figure grew brighter, casting an almost surreal glow across the wasteland. It felt like the very air around him was charged with energy, as though something monumental was on the verge of happening. The creature that had been chasing him, a monstrosity born from his deepest fears, had vanished into the shadows, but its presence still lingered in the back of his mind. The nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. But something inside him was different now. Something had shifted. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady, the feeling of the earth beneath his feet now more solid than before. He was still in the dream, still trapped in NOXCAPE, but for the first time, he could sense an opportunity. There was a chance now, a sliver of hope, and he wasn't going to waste it. The figure ahead seemed to be waiting for him, as though it had always known he would find it, but not before being tested. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to approach cautiously, but he didn't have the luxury of time. Every second felt like it might be his last, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. His breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps as he forced his legs to move faster, the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the ground matching the rapid thrum of his heart. As he neared the figure, the world around him began to change once again. The barren landscape shifted into something far more extraordinary, a forest of enormous, towering trees with silver leaves that shimmered in the light. The ground was covered in soft moss that seemed to glow faintly, and the air was thick with a sweet, unfamiliar scent. The world felt more real than anything Ethan had ever experienced. Each detail was vivid, almost tangible, like he could reach out and touch the surroundings. But no matter how real the world seemed, Ethan knew that it was still part of the dream, still part of the machine that controlled his every move. As he approached the figure, the sense of dread he had carried with him began to fade, replaced by something else, a curiosity, a strange pull towards the unknown. The figure, cloaked in shadows, did not move, but its presence was overwhelming. Its eyes, still gleaming like distant stars, focused intently on him. Ethan stopped just short of the figure, unsure of what to do next. He wanted to speak, to ask it questions, but the words wouldn't come. There was a silent understanding between them, an unspoken connection that seemed to transcend language. For a long moment, the two stood there, locked in a strange, tense silence. The world around them felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, for the next phase of this bizarre journey to begin. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. What was this figure? What role did it play in the dream? Was it friend or foe? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Before he could ask any of these questions, the figure slowly raised its hand and gestured for Ethan to follow. There was no hesitation in its movement, no sign of doubt. It was as if it had been waiting for him all along, and now that he had arrived, the next step in the journey was about to unfold. Ethan, still unsure, decided to follow. There was no turning back now. The figure led him deeper into the forest, the trees parting to reveal a narrow path that wound its way through the undergrowth. As they walked, the air seemed to grow thicker, the atmosphere heavier with each step. The silence was profound, the only sound the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind, questions bouncing around in his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The further they traveled, the more the dream seemed to morph, as if each step was taking him further from the world he knew. The path twisted and turned, the trees growing taller, their trunks twisting in unnatural ways. The landscape around them grew more fantastical, more surreal with each passing moment. Ethan couldn't understand how something that felt so real could be so strange, so utterly alien. They finally came to a clearing where the figure stopped. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone archway, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to glow with an ethereal light. The carvings were unrecognizable, strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as Ethan stared at them. The air around the archway hummed with a faint electric charge, and Ethan could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending around this place. The figure turned to Ethan, its glowing eyes fixing on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. It did not speak, but the message was clear. This was the next step in his journey. He had to cross the threshold. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his body tense with anticipation. He had no idea what lay beyond the archway, but he could feel the pull, the undeniable force that urged him to move forward. With a final deep breath, he stepped into the archway, his foot crossing the threshold. The world shifted again, this time with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. The ground beneath him seemed to melt away, replaced by a swirling vortex of colors and light. Ethan felt as though he was being pulled in every direction at once, his body caught in the tide of the dream's strange power. The figure was gone, leaving him alone in the vortex. For what felt like an eternity, Ethan was trapped in the swirling chaos, unable to see, unable to think. He had no control over where he was going or what was happening. All he could do was hold on, his body and mind frantically trying to make sense of the madness around him. It felt as though the dream was consuming him, devouring him whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. Ethan found himself standing on solid ground once more, but the landscape had changed yet again. The world before him was an alien planet, the sky a deep shade of purple, streaked with black clouds. The ground was a dark, cracked desert, and in the distance he could see towering structures, their sharp, angular shapes unlike anything he had ever seen. This place felt wrong. It was like a nightmare, but a nightmare that Ethan had no choice but to face. The adventure was far from over, and the machine's hold on him had only grown stronger. Now, more than ever, he would need to confront the forces that controlled his destiny. Ethan could feel it. This was where the true test began. There was no turning back now. The machine had shown him a glimpse of his deepest fears, but it had also given him the strength to face them. And now he had to fight, not just to survive, but to regain control of his own dreams. The real journey had only just begun. Ethan stood at the edge of the strange desert, his heart pounding in his chest as the alien landscape stretched before him. The purple sky above seemed to pulse with energy, its dark clouds swirling ominously as if alive, watching him. The towering structures in the distance loomed like ancient sentinels, their jagged edges piercing the sky. A sense of dread settled in his stomach, but at the same time, a spark of determination flared inside him. This was his test, the next phase of the dream. A challenge unlike any he had faced before. The landscape felt hostile, unnatural, as though the very ground beneath his feet could swallow him whole at any moment. His footsteps left no mark on the cracked earth, and the air felt thick with a strange heaviness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan could almost hear the whispers in the distance, low and haunting, harried on the wind. They weren't words, just sounds, but they sent a shiver down his spine. It was as though the very atmosphere was alive, a silent observer of his every move. He had crossed the threshold of the stone archway, but in doing so, he had left behind more than just the world he knew. He had entered a place of dreams and nightmares, NOXCAPE, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. The machine, whatever it was, had stripped away his sense of safety. He had no idea what was real anymore, what was part of the dream, and what was a product of his own mind. Ethan knew he had to keep moving. Standing still would only make him an easy target for whatever creatures or horrors lurked in this strange, hostile land. He took a deep breath and forced his legs to move forward, each step heavier than the last. His senses were heightened, every sound amplified, every shadow in the distance sending his mind into overdrive. He didn't know how much longer he could last in this place, but he had to keep going. There was no other choice. As he walked, the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. The cracked desert gave way to something more solid, the terrain growing smoother as he drew closer to the towering structures. The whispers grew louder, but he couldn't make out the words. It was like being surrounded by 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, blending together in a confusing, disorienting melody. He tried to ignore them, to focus on the path ahead, but it was hard. His mind was already strained from the journey, and the constant pressure of NOXCAPE was beginning to take its toll. He paused for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He had to remember what he had learned so far. This place, this machine, was designed to test him. Every trial, every obstacle, was meant to push him to his limits. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to regain control. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the familiar spark of determination rise within him. He wasn't going to let the machine win. Not now. Not ever. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement in the distance. Someone, was approaching. At first, he thought it was a mirage, the oppressive heat playing tricks on his eyes. But as the figure drew closer, he realized it was real. It was humanoid, but there was something distinctly otherworldly about it. The figure's skin was a dark, almost metallic gray, its limbs long and slender, moving with an eerie grace. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was set in a permanent, emotionless line. Ethan froze, his body instinctively tensing. Was this another test? Another obstacle to overcome? He had no idea, but he couldn't afford to back down. The figure stopped a few paces away from him, its glowing eyes studying him with an intensity that felt almost invasive. Ethan's pulse quickened. He wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, but the words wouldn't come. He could only stand there, feeling the weight of its gaze on him. The figure reached up and touched its own forehead, and for a moment, Ethan thought it might attack. But instead, the figure's eyes softened, and it took a step back. Ethan felt a strange shift in the air, a subtle change in the atmosphere. It was as if the world itself was reacting to the presence of this being, as if it were a part of the landscape, an entity that was connected to everything around him. The figure held up a hand, and in its palm, a small, shimmering orb materialized. It hovered there, suspended in midair, radiating an eerie, otherworldly glow. Ethan's gaze was drawn to the orb, unable to look away. It was beautiful, yet unsettling. The figure slowly extended the orb toward him, its movements fluid, almost hypnotic. Ethan hesitated. What was the figure offering him? Was it some sort of gift or a trap? He had no way of knowing, but he couldn't ignore the pull of the orb. It was calling to him, the same way the machine had called to him before. This was another test, another choice he had to make. But for the first time since entering NOXCAPE, Ethan felt a surge of hope. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling slightly, and took the orb into his own palm. The moment his fingers closed around it, the world around him shifted again. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Ethan felt a jolt of power surge through him, as though the very fabric of the dream was reacting to his decision. He could feel the machine's presence, its grip tightening, but this time he wasn't afraid. The orb pulsed in his hand, and the world before him began to dissolve, the desert fading into nothingness as the towering structures melted away. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but Ethan stood his ground. He wasn't going to let the dream consume him. He wasn't going to let NOXCAPE win. With a final burst of energy, the orb flared bright, and everything went dark. When the light faded, Ethan found himself standing in a new place. The ground beneath his feet was soft and green, and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. The sky above was a vibrant blue, the sun shining brightly. It was a stark contrast to the desolate, hostile landscape he had just left behind. He was no longer alone. Standing before him was a group of figures, humanoid, but with features that were unlike anything he had seen before. They were tall, their skin shimmering with an iridescent glow, their eyes glowing with the same light as the orb. They were watching him with silent curiosity, but there was no malice in their gaze. Ethan knew he had entered a new phase of the dream, a new challenge. But this time, he felt ready. He had made it this far. And no matter what NOXCAPE threw at him next, he was determined to see it through. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Ethan felt in control. The machine had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it hadn't broken him. And now he was ready to face whatever came next. Ethan stood in the heart of the strange, vibrant world, feeling a sense of awe wash over him. The iridescent beings surrounding him looked unlike anything he had ever encountered. Their translucent skin shimmered under the bright sun, casting beautiful prismatic reflections across the ground. Their eyes, glowing with an ethereal light, fixed on him, but their expressions were not hostile. If anything, they radiated a calm, silent curiosity. He felt like an intruder in their world, though he knew this place was somehow part of the test, a piece of the dream. Every fiber of his being told him that he needed to keep moving, to explore this new phase. But the pressure of the unknown gripped his chest. These beings were something more than human, something far beyond his understanding. The lead figure, taller than the others, stepped forward with a smooth, deliberate motion. Its body seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the universe, as if it was in tune with the very fabric of the dreamscape around them. Ethan could feel the air around him shift as the figure approached, a quiet hum filling the space between them. It tilted its head slightly, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if it was trying to communicate with him. Its glowing eyes studied him, and then, without a sound, it raised its hand toward him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to do, but instinctively, he stepped forward, matching the figure's motion. As he reached out, a soft vibration coursed through his fingertips, making the air around them shimmer. The orb in his hand responded as well, glowing brighter and warmer, as if it recognized the gesture. The being's hand stopped just inches from his, and Ethan felt a strange sensation, like the space between them was collapsing, folding in on itself. It was as though the boundaries of reality were bending. The figure's eyes locked with his, and for the first time, Ethan felt a deep understanding. Though no words were spoken, he sensed that the being knew his fears, his desires, and his resolve. It understood the journey he had undertaken, the trials he had endured, and the choices he had made. And in that brief moment, he felt a connection that transcended words. The being's hand continued its slow, deliberate movement, reaching for the orb. Ethan hesitated for only a second before allowing the orb to pass from his hand into the figure's grasp. As soon as the orb touched the being's skin, the world around them seemed to pulse in a harmonic rhythm. The air vibrated with energy, and for a moment, it felt like time itself was stretching and warping. Then suddenly, everything went still. The glowing being stepped back, holding the orb in its hand, now glowing even brighter, its light becoming a beacon in the quiet space. The rest of the beings remained silent, watching as the orb pulsed with energy in the lead figure's grasp. Ethan stood frozen, unable to take his eyes off the orb. It was as if the entire world hinged on the next moment. Was this the moment of his transformation? Was this the key to unlocking the dream's true purpose? Without a word, the lead figure raised the orb higher, and as it did, the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The vibrant green grass started to grow, spreading out in all directions, but this time, it was different. The grass wasn't just growing, it was transforming. It was changing into something more, something alive in a way Ethan couldn't understand. The vibrant hues of the landscape deepened, as if the orb was awakening the very essence of the world. Ethan could feel the power in the air, and with it, a sense of urgency. This was no longer just a test. It was something much bigger. As the ground around him shifted, he saw that structures were emerging from the earth, tall, jagged spires that stretched far into the sky, made of materials that defied logic. The air shimmered with light and energy, as if the world itself was being rebuilt, remade. The beings around him started to move, their graceful forms weaving through the changing landscape, guiding the transformation. There was no chaos, no frantic rush. Everything seemed to happen with perfect synchronization. Ethan couldn't help but watch in awe as the land shifted, each movement deliberate, each structure placed with intention. The world was alive, and it was evolving in front of him. In the distance, a massive structure began to rise, towering over everything else. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was a combination of organic and mechanical elements, as if technology and nature had fused together. It was both beautiful and intimidating, with intricate patterns carved into its surface, pulsating with the same rhythm as the orb. As the beam continued to hold the orb, Ethan felt the pull of the structure. There was something within it, something that called to him. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel its presence, drawing him in. The lead figure's glowing eyes shifted to the structure and then back to him, as if it understood the connection. It lowered the orb slightly, and with a sudden movement, pointed toward the massive structure in the distance. Ethan's heart raced. This was it. This was where the journey would lead him. The structure was his destination, but it wasn't just about reaching it. He knew that whatever lay within would test him in ways he couldn't imagine. He had to go there, to face whatever challenge awaited him, to unlock the next stage of his journey. The beings around him began to move again, this time in unison, guiding him toward the structure. The path ahead was clear, but Ethan couldn't help but feel a rising sense of dread. The closer he got to the structure, the more he felt like he was being drawn into something far greater than himself. As he stepped forward, the world around him seemed to warp again. The air thickened, and the colors of the landscape shifted, becoming darker, more intense. The towering spires that had once seemed so majestic now appeared foreboding, their edges sharp and jagged. The whispers from before grew louder, but this time they weren't just whispers, they were voices. The voices of those who had walked this path before him, their stories of success and failure echoing in the air. Ethan pressed forward, his resolve hardening. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead in that structure, he would face it head-on, no matter the cost. The dream was calling him, and he had no choice but to follow. The journey had only just begun. The massive structure loomed ahead of Ethan, its intricate design both intimidating and awe-inspiring. The closer he got, the more he could feel the energy emanating from within it, a deep hum that reverberated through his chest. The air around him was thick with anticipation, and each step felt like he was walking closer to some kind of revelation. The once vibrant landscape had now faded into darker tones, the colors twisting into ominous shades as if the dream itself had shifted its mood. Ethan could see the entrance now, an enormous archway that stretched high into the sky, its surface glowing faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light. As he neared the doorway, he felt a strange pull, as though the very structure was beckoning him. The figures, the ethereal beings who had led him this far, stood at a distance, silent and still, their presence unwavering. They didn't speak, but there was an unmistakable understanding between them and Ethan. This moment was his alone. No more guidance, no more comforting hums from the orb. This was where he would find his true purpose, or be lost to the depths of the unknown forever. His heart raced as he stood before the archway, taking in the patterns carved into the walls of the structure. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, symbols, lines, and shapes that seemed to shift as his eyes moved over them. They spoke to him in a way he couldn't explain, drawing him in, as if they were calling out to something deep within him. Was this the key to unlocking the final piece of the dream? He stepped forward, and as his foot touched the ground beneath the arch, a soft vibration filled the air. It was subtle at first, but soon it grew stronger, more intense. The structure seemed to react to his presence, its light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. A doorway materialized in front of him, its edges shimmering with a blue glow, as if reality itself was bending around it. Without thinking, Ethan walked through the threshold. The world beyond was nothing like he had imagined. At first glance, it seemed like an endless void, a vast expanse of nothingness stretching out into infinity. But as he took a few more steps, the space around him began to transform. Colors exploded in front of him, swirling and blending together like paint on a canvas. The void turned into a surreal landscape, a place that felt both familiar and alien at once. Mountains rose and fell in the distance, rivers of light flowed through the land, and strange floating islands hovered in the air, their surfaces covered in a shimmering mist. Ethan looked around, his mind reeling. This place felt alive. It was as if the world itself was aware of his presence, reacting to his every move. The energy in the air was palpable, thick with potential. He could feel the weight of the dream pressing in on him, pushing him forward. There was no going back now. Whatever lay ahead was something he would have to face alone. As he ventured deeper into the land, he saw something in the distance, a shape moving slowly across the horizon. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but as he drew closer it became clearer. It was a figure, humanoid in shape, walking steadily toward him. Its form was cloaked in shadow, its features hidden beneath a dark hood. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Was this a part of the dream's final test? Could this figure be another guide, or was it something more sinister? The figure drew nearer, and as it approached, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of recognition. It was as though he knew this being, even though he couldn't remember ever having seen it before. The figure's presence was both comforting and unsettling, like something long forgotten, something buried deep within him. Finally, the figure stopped just a few feet away, its hooded head tilting slightly as if studying him. Ethan stood frozen, unable to move, his mind racing with questions. Who was this figure? What did it want from him? Then the figure spoke, its voice low and soft, but carrying with it an unmistakable authority. You have come far, Ethan. But the journey is not yet complete. The words struck Ethan like a blow, and a chill ran down his spine. How did this being know his name? And what did it mean by the journey was not yet complete? The figure raised its hand, and a bright light exploded from its palm, blinding Ethan for a moment. When the light faded, the landscape had changed again. This time, he was standing at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast ocean of swirling energy. The waves of energy crashed against the shore, sending ripples through the very air itself. The final test awaits you, the figure said, its voice now echoing in Ethan's mind. You have unlocked the potential within you, but to truly understand the dream, you must face the choice that lies ahead. Will you step forward into the unknown, or will you turn back, content with what you've discovered so far? Ethan stared into the swirling energy, feeling the pull of the unknown. This was the moment. Everything he had experienced, all the trials, all the challenges, had led him here. This was the ultimate choice, the one that would define who he was, who he would become. The figure remained silent, watching him, waiting for his decision. Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He had come this far, and he knew deep down that there was no turning back now. He couldn't be content with just discovering the surface of this dream. There was something more, something that he needed to understand. With that resolve, he stepped forward, toward the swirling ocean of energy, embracing the unknown with open arms. The figure nodded, a faint smile on its hidden face. You have chosen wisely. Now, the dream can truly begin. As Ethan stepped into the ocean of energy, the world around him exploded into light, and for the first time, he felt truly awake. The dream was no longer a test, it was his reality.